Australia wasn't always one nation. For the first decades of British colonization, it was a patchwork of separate colonies, each with its own government, laws, and identity. From New South Wales in the east to Western Australia in the west, 6 colonies ruled their own affairs, often in competition rather than cooperation. The British arrival in 1788 marked the beginning of a colonial experiment, and over the next decades, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania developed as self-governing colonies. Each colony had its own parliament, laws, and even its own tariffs and trade rules. Despite sharing a common language, culture, and allegiance to the British Crown, the colonies often found themselves at odds. Disputes over trade routes, border definitions, and immigration policies created tension. In many ways, Australia was not one country. It was 6 separate nations, each looking after its own interests. Yet even in these early years, some visionaries began to imagine something bigger. Newspapers published letters and editorials calling for a united Australia, and early thinkers debated the benefits of federation. The idea wasn't just about politics, it was about identity. Could Australians see themselves as more than colonists of Britain? Could a collective identity emerge that would allow them to stand together in matters of defense, trade, and governance? By the mid-1800s, the conversation had begun. Organizations, public meetings, and intellectual societies were starting to explore the concept of federation, not as a distant dream, but as a necessary future for a continent still divided. By the mid-19th century, the Australian colonies were growing fast. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne were thriving, railways were expanding, and trade was booming. Yet, despite economic growth, the colonies were isolated from one another, each acting independently, often at odds with its neighbors. Intercolonial disputes were common. Customs duties between colonies made trade complicated, and inconsistent immigration policies created tensions. Defense was another concern. With the ever-present threat of foreign powers, especially Russia, the colonies realized that acting alone would leave them vulnerable. It became clear that unity was not just a dream, it was a necessity. The idea of federation began to take root not only among politicians but also in newspapers, clubs, and public debates. Visionaries and early thinkers like Sir Henry Parkes began traveling between colonies, speaking about the benefits of a united Australia. They argued that a federation would protect against foreign threats, standardize trade and tariffs, strengthen political representation, promote a shared national identity. Public meetings, essays, and pamphlets began to spread the message. People from all walks of life were encouraged to consider the advantages of coming together under a single federal government. The seeds of nationalism were being sown, even in a land still tied to Britain. Despite enthusiasm, federation faced significant obstacles. Colonies were wary of losing autonomy. New South Wales, the largest and wealthiest colony, feared being burdened with the others' problems. Smaller colonies worried about being dominated by New South Wales. Compromise would be essential. But for now, the vision remained just that, a vision. And so by the late 1870s, Australia stood at a crossroads. The conversation about unity was no longer private speculation. It had entered the public consciousness. Citizens were beginning to ask a question that would shape the continent's future. Could 6 colonies, each protective of its own interests, find a way to stand together as one nation? The push for unity had begun. But turning vision into reality would require one powerful speech, one determined leader, and a chain of events that would ignite the federation movement like never before. By the 1880s, the dream of a united Australia was gathering momentum, but the colonies remained cautious. It would take a bold voice to turn scattered ideas into a movement that could unite a continent. That voice belonged to Sir Henry Parkes, often called the father of federation. A statesman from New South Wales, Parkes understood that Australia's future depended on cooperation, not rivalry. In October 1889, he delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in Australian history, the Tenterfield Oration. Standing in the town of Tenterfield, Parkes addressed a crowd with a vision of a united Australia. He spoke of a federation that would allow the colonies to defend themselves, manage trade efficiently, and develop a national identity. But he also spoke of pride in the land, in its people, and in a shared destiny. In his speech, Parkes urged the colonies to rise above local rivalries. He argued that a united federal government would protect all Australians, allowing them to prosper economically, socially, and politically. The oration electrified the public. Newspapers across the colonies printed his words, sparking debates and discussions in towns and cities. People began to see federation not as a distant dream, but as an achievable goal. The Tenterfield Oration also set in motion the first federal conventions, gatherings, of representatives from all colonies to draft proposals and negotiate the framework for a united Australia. Yet, even after this historic speech, agreement was far from guaranteed. Each colony had its own priorities and concerns, from tariffs and trade policies to defense and representation. The challenge was not just to imagine a federation, it was to negotiate one that all 6 colonies could accept. Parks had inspired the dream, but the real work was only beginning. The next step would be drafting a constitution, a document that would balance power, resolve disputes, and ultimately make federation a reality, and that work would shape the future of a nation forever. With the dream of federation alive, the next step was the most challenging of all, putting it into words. Australia needed a constitution, a blueprint for a nation that could unite 6 colonies with different sizes, economies, and priorities. The first National Australasian Convention was held in 1891 in Sydney. Delegates from all the colonies gathered to debate and draft a federal constitution. It was a task that required compromise, patience, and vision. The debates were intense. Questions arose that could make or break federation. How would power be divided between the central government and the states? How would trade and tariffs be managed? What representation would small colonies have in a national parliament? And what rights would citizens enjoy under this new system? Over months of discussion, delegates worked tirelessly. They studied constitutions from other nations, especially the United States, but adapted the ideas to suit Australia's unique needs. The draft included a bicameral parliament with the House of Representatives representing population and the Senate protecting smaller states. Shared responsibilities between federal and state governments, balancing local autonomy with national unity. Provisions for defense, trade regulation, and lawmaking powers. Even with the draft complete, federation was far from guaranteed. Each colony needed to approve the Constitution through a referendum, and opinions varied widely. Some colonies feared losing control over local affairs. Others worried about economic disadvantages. By 1898, referendums had been held in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, and Queensland. Some passed easily. Others required reworking of clauses to satisfy public concern. These negotiations and revisions demonstrated one clear truth. Federation required not only vision but also consensus, compromise, and public support. The Constitution was more than a legal document, it was a promise. A promise that 6 diverse colonies could unite under a common purpose, sharing power while protecting local interests. And yet one final hurdle remained before Australia could officially become a nation. Drafting the Constitution was only half the battle. Convincing every colony to say yes would test political skill, public opinion, and the patience of an entire continent. The road to federation was almost complete, but the journey was not over. By the late 1890s, Australia had a draft constitution, a blueprint for a united nation. But having a document on paper was only the beginning. Now came the true challenge, convincing the people of every colony to say yes. The process required referendums in each colony. While some colonies embraced the idea of federation enthusiastically, others were hesitant. New South Wales, the largest and wealthiest colony, worried about shouldering the economic burden of smaller states. Western Australia, isolated and independent-minded, feared losing its autonomy. To win approval, compromises were necessary. Key clauses in the Constitution were adjusted to satisfy concerns about trade, representation, and state rights. Public campaigns were launched, educating citizens on the benefits of federation, from defense and national security to standardized laws and economic growth. Newspapers printed persuasive essays, town halls were filled with debates, and civic leaders traveled across the colonies rallying support. Indigenous Australians were, unfortunately, still largely excluded from these discussions, reflecting the social inequalities of the era. After years of negotiation, campaigning, and adjustments, the colonies gradually came on board. By 1900, all colonies had agreed to join the Federation except Western Australia. Economic incentives and political pressure persuaded Western Australia to hold its own referendum, and they too finally said, yes. With every colony in agreement, Australia was now poised to step into a new chapter of its history. But the final step required approval from the British Crown. Only then could the dream of a united Australia become reality. All the debates, compromises, and campaigns had led to this moment. The colonies were united in vision, but would the British government recognize the birth of a new nation? The answer would come on the very first day of the 20th century. The moment Australia had been waiting for finally arrived. On the first day of the 20th century, January 3, 1901, the 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, officially became one nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. The new nation was founded on a federal constitution, balancing powers between the central government and the states. The constitution provided for a bicameral parliament, with the House of Representatives reflecting population and the Senate protecting smaller states. It set the framework for national defense, trade, and lawmaking, giving Australia the tools to govern itself while remaining part of the British Empire. Across the country, celebrations marked the historic occasion. In Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide, citizens gathered in streets and public halls, waving flags and attending ceremonies. Speeches were made, proclamations read, and for the first time Australians truly felt the birth of their own nation. The first Governor-General, Lord Hopetoun, was appointed, as was the first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton. These leaders faced the monumental task of shaping a government that could unite diverse regions and populations under a shared vision. Federation was more than just a political achievement. It was a symbol of identity. It marked the transition from 6 separate colonies, often in competition, to a single united nation with shared laws, responsibilities, and a growing sense of national pride. Yet federation was also just the beginning. The new nation faced the challenge of defining its place in the world, navigating economic growth, defense, immigration, and social change. But on that historic day, Australians had taken the first step together toward a future they could shape as one. From 6 separate colonies to a united Commonwealth, the journey to federation was a story of vision, compromise, and determination. Australia had become a nation, but the story of its growth, challenges, and achievements was only just beginning. If you want to uncover more untold stories from history, make sure to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more fascinating journeys through time.